We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. Even so, I am sure that had I lived in Germany at the time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers. If today I had lived in a communist country where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I would have openly advocated disobeying that country's anti-religious laws. I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the greatest stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klan,
but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Lukeman, and this is Brick by Brick. So this new series that I've been talking about for a couple of weeks actually, is a little bit different from the series that we've done here at Brick by Brick, because while it's going to be heavy on history, it's a series that we sort of decided that needed to be done in order to address an issue that has arisen, especially in the progressive circles. Because as much as we would like to believe that we've gotten beyond the issues of racism in this country, and especially in the progressive or liberal movement, it's obvious that we really haven't. And the words from Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter from the Birmingham Jail speak to a phenomenon that has existed in well-meaning white moderate communities in response to Black people fighting against racism and fighting for justice, that Martin Luther King Jr. himself believed was a bigger threat to the progress against racism, was a bigger threat to progress for racial justice in this country than actual members of the Klan and actual members of the Concerned Citizens Council, which basically was the business wing of the Ku Klux Klan. And that threat to racial progress is the lukewarm, kind of dismissive attitude of what Martin Luther King Jr. called the white moderate. See, in his letter, he absolutely talked about the need for Black people to fight for justice and the frustration that so many of us felt when people who are supposed to be our allies, people who are supposed to fight with us and for us, actually don't. And he talked about how some Black people become so frustrated and disenfranchised with the lack of progress America has made on this issue that they simply give up on the promise that America claims to espouse for all of us. And they turn to what he believed was the threat of Black nationalism. Now, of course, full disclosure, I don't believe that black nationalism is a threat, because black nationalism is a very different entity. It's a very different concept from white nationalism. Black nationalism is rooted in the liberation of black people from white supremacist, colonialist, imperialist oppression of black people around the world in the establishment of a black nation, a free black nation. That's what black nationalism is. White nationalism is a whole different monster altogether, and it is what we are seeing bubbling to the surface, I suppose, in the Trump era. But make no mistake, white nationalism is normal in America. It's just been called different things. We've called it the Klan. We've called it the Concerned Citizens Council. Now we call it the alt-right. We've called it white nationalist or white supremacist groups before. But it's a very familiar monster. And the thing about white nationalism is that black people aren't actually surprised by it. When the Klan of today, they still exist, hold rallies, black people are not actually surprised by Klan rallies. We've grown up with the Klan. Even black people in my generation. The Klan has never gone away. White people are usually surprised by the Klan, which is always a surprise to me. But I have to remember that white people do not occupy a space, not a social space, not an economic space, not a political space in this country that black people do. So what surprises white people usually doesn't freak black people out too much. But like Martin Luther King Jr., what does continue to surprise many black people, I will admit that it surprises me when I see it from time to time, is this lukewarm acceptance of our fight for racial justice and equality and true liberation that we receive from the people that Martin Luther King Jr. called the white moderate. And these are people who say, yes, I agree with what your purposes are. I agree with your goals. I just don't like the way you're pursuing them. That's why when Martin Luther King Jr. said in his letter from the Birmingham jail, this lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. The Klan we get. They're doing exactly what they said their purpose is. The well-meaning white moderate who is focused more on resisting how we fight for our liberation and freedom. The tone we use when we talk about racism. The tactics we use that they feel they have to both approve of and be involved in and control. And the pace at which we expect our liberation and freedom to come, not to be granted to us because we were born free, but to come through the people who have denied us, the apparatus that has denied us, and that is our government. That's bewildering. That people would be in opposition of how we do this. But these are people who are supposed to be supportive of our goals. So in this discussion about race, yes, I am absolutely going to talk about some history because you know I love talking about history. Without understanding the history behind some of these issues, we're never going to get it. And I do recognize that many well-meaning white people, many white moderates, just don't understand the history. But many do. So for those who understand the history and are still opposed to our methods, our tone, our expectations, especially when we're calling out racism among the white moderate, or let's call it today the white progressive or the white liberal community, especially those of you who are frustrated with us because we're calling out racism among you. I want to talk in this series not just about the history of racism, but I want to talk to you about why your responses to the way we fight for our liberation and equality serve to perpetuate the very racism you claim to want to get rid of just as much as we do. So I'm going to be reading some things from my notes. I'm going to be chatting with you. So bear with me, you guys. And I do actually see you over there in the comments. I'm not going to comment because I don't like to get distracted in these discussions, but just bear with me while I do a little bit of both. Now, listen, it is true that we have had years and years, probably 400 years since we've been here, of trying to explain to America what racism is and what racism isn't. And in those conversations, we almost always, almost invariably get pushback from nice white people who want to fight with us about how we should do it. And Martin Luther King Jr. says of that he believes that he reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negroes, that's what we called ourselves back then because that's what the law called us, the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen councilor of the Klan, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. So we're hearing a lot from well-meaning white progressives, well-meaning white liberals, well-meaning white moderates who call for unity. When we talk about racism, when we're calling out racial issues, but they don't actually want justice. What they actually want is for us to stop calling out racism. They don't want the uncomfortability. They don't want the difficult conversation that comes with us calling out racism in our own progressive, liberal, left community. They don't want that accountability. They just want the discussion of race to go away. And they do this to the point of saying things that they think sound really good and really transcendent of the whole issue of race, but are actually very damaging. And they end up derailing the support of racial justice for Black people. One of the things that white people, well-meaning white liberals, the white moderates, the white progressives say when they don't really want to talk about actual racism, especially among their own community, is that they don't see color. Now, again, I know that sounds really good. It sounds so above the evils and the fray of racism, doesn't it? I don't see color. Why can't other people just treat everyone the same, as if color doesn't exist? And then some people go as far as to say, well, listen, why do we continue to focus on race? Because race isn't even real. Race is just a made-up construct. So why are we still judging people based on a made-up construct? Well, the problem with that attitude, the problem with those statements, the problem with those responses is that people believe that just acting as if race isn't a problem is going to solve racism. But the rest of society doesn't operate like that. So one person's refusal to see race doesn't equate to the actual dismantling of structural, systemic, historical racism and all its legacies. I'm not even going to get into the issue of how I personally feel about people saying they don't see my color. That's not an issue here. I'm going to try very hard to stay away from my personal feelings. That's difficult, but I'm going to try very hard to do that. What's important in how this response of I don't see color and we need to get rid of labels and race isn't even real, so why are we even talking about it? The actual problem with those responses is they are devoid of any rooting or foundation in the reality of what this country was actually based on. See, the idea that the color of one's skin or race as we know it determines the legal status of a human being in regard to freedom, citizenship, slavery, and alien status began in this country in the first colonies. So to understand why that's true, this is where the history comes in. Before the transatlantic slave trade ever happened, there were Africans in this country who were free. One of the places where we have the clearest view of the transition from free Africans who lived in the colonies, though, to enslaved Africans, and that period of time is called the terrible transformation, is in the colony of Virginia. In the early years of the colony, many Africans and poor whites, most of the laborers, remember we did the series on the last series we did where we talked about white people from Europe, or Europeans as they were called then. There were no white people then. They were Europeans who came to this country as indentured servants. Some were kidnapped, absolutely, but some came here willingly. And they served in indentured servitude for a period of time. Indentured servitude was a legal, contractual status. It was a labor contract. Now, this is not to say that indentured servitude, that indentured servants were not mistreated horribly in many cases. In many cases, yes, they were. To the point that indentured servants actually fomented insurrections against their contract owners throughout the colonies. But indentured servants were Africans, Europeans from all over Europe. There was no racial designation to indentured servitude contracts in the early colonies. So during this time, black and white men and women worked side by side in the fields. Black and white men who broke their servant contract were equally punished. All were indentured servants. During their time as servants, they were fed and housed, and afterward they'd be given what were known as freedom dues. This is the key difference between indentured servitude before chattel slavery was instituted in the Americas and chattel slavery that was racialized. Indentured contracts ended. And when those contracts ended, former indentured servants were now free, and they were paid for their labor in wages and usually land, and they were allowed to go about their way enjoying the full rights of citizenship in the colonies. None of that was true for racialized chattel slavery. So, historically, the English only enslaved non-Christians, actually. We talked about that in the last series, and not in particular Africans. It was not a racialized system. The status of slave, the status of a slave was not a lifelong status. It couldn't be passed down by birth. It was a finite labor contract. The first Virginia colonists didn't even think of themselves, like I said, as white. They didn't use the word to describe themselves. It wasn't in any of their documentation. They saw themselves as Christians or Englishmen, or in terms of their social class, they were landowners. They were judges. They were clergy. They were servants. But there was a transformation from indentured servitude to racially based slavery for black people. Not Europeans, not Irish, not British, not Italians, black people. And it began with the misrepresented history, the misinterpreted history of Anthony Johnson. Now, Anthony Johnson was a free black man who owned property in Virginia. One of the few recorded histories of an African in America that we can tell from early court records. He was initially called Antonio the Negro. And the Negro was merely a term used to describe a person. That's all it was at that time. In 1625, there was a census in Virginia in 1625, and that is how he was categorized. Now, at this time, English and colonial law didn't define racial slavery. It didn't exist. The census called him not a slave, but a servant. Words mattered even then. So later, Antonio changed his name to Anthony Johnson. How could he have done that if he were a slave with no rights? He couldn't have. At this point, he has ended his contract of indentured servitude. He is free and he can do what he pleases. He married an African American servant named Mary. They had 4 children. Mary and Anthony also became free. Their children also became free upon birth because Mary became free out of her contract. 2 free people in the Virginia colony having children who are free, just like Europeans. He soon owned land and cattle and even indentured servants of his own. Cannot stress enough, indentured servitude was not conditional upon ethnicity, skin color, or race. By 1650, Anthony was still one of only 400 Africans in the colony among nearly 19,000 settlers. In Johnson's own county, at least 20 African men and women were free, and 13 owned their own homes, just 13. Listen to those numbers. 400 Africans out of 19,000 settlers. In the year 1640, the year Johnson purchased his first property, 3 indentured servants fled a Virginia plantation. They were caught, they were sentenced to be whipped, and they were returned to their owner. 2 European indentured servants had their servitude extended for 4 years. However, the third was a man named John Punch, who was an African. He was sentenced to serve his master or his assigns for the time of his natural life. Let me repeat that. 3 indentured servants escape a plantation. 2 are European, 1 is African. The 2 Europeans have their indentured sentences extended by 4 years. 4 years, that's it. The African is sentenced to serve the rest of his natural life as a slave to his current owner or whomever else he is assigned to by his current owner. His current owner was Anthony Johnson. Now, this story is so often misinterpreted by white people who are racists and who absolutely do not want to talk about racism, and they use it to dismiss the horrors of slavery and the responsibility that white settlers had in going along with and expanding slavery. They argue that, well, slavery was started by a black man in the United States, but that's not actually the history. Because the history actually is that John Punch was the subject of a contract dispute between two indentured servant masters or owners or contract holders. John Punch ran away from Anthony Johnson's employ, but he said that his contract was up. He runs away to another contract holder who says, I'll buy your contract. So then Johnson and the other contract holder get into a dispute over the validity of John Punch's indentured servitude contract. Now you would think that the judge would be able to distinguish a fairer sentence than committing John Punch to lifetime indentured servitude. But he didn't. And from what we can tell from the record, the only thing that differentiated John Punch from the two other indentured servants was that he was African and they were Europeans. This is the first recorded history in the colonies of a court decision making a determination on the freedom of a member of the colony based on the color of their skin. Anthony Johnson was not responsible for starting slavery in the United States. That was the judge who sentenced John Punch to a lifetime of indentured servitude. Now, even though both European and African indentured servants rose up together against the landowning classes across the colonies throughout this time, laws were eventually passed that targeted the African-descended colonists who were indentured servants in particular. Like in 1641, Massachusetts became the first colony to legally recognize slavery. Not indentured servitude, but slavery. Other states, such as Virginia, followed. In 1662, Virginia decided that all children born in the colony to a slave mother would also be enslaved. Slavery was now not only a lifelong condition, remember, after that first decision, sentencing John Punch to lifetime servitude, slavery was not only a lifelong condition, but now it could be passed down to the next generation, like skin color. So for the people who use the history of Anthony Johnson as the example of why white America is not culpable for the horrors of slavery in the United States, they conveniently forget not only the facts of the case, but what happened to Anthony Johnson and his descendants in the colonies afterward. Because in 1665, Anthony Johnson moved to Maryland and leased a 300-acre plantation where he died 5 years later. But back in Virginia, the same year, 1665, a jury decided the land Johnson left could be seized by the government because he was, and I quote, a Negro and by consequence an alien. From being identified in the census as a Negro just as a marker of identification to the identification of Negro being used to determine your citizenship status and in effect your rights as a human being in the colony in one generation, not even that long. In 1705, Virginia declared that all servants imported and brought in this county who were not Christians in their native country shall be slaves. A Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves shall be held to be real estate. So in effect, the very person that the obvious racist and white supremacy deniers who blame for starting slavery in the United States, they conveniently leave out the part of the history where Anthony Johnson's immediate descendants, his children, were denied rights as free citizens in the colonies their father lived in. So regardless of how well-meaning white moderates or progressives want to believe that we can eliminate racism and the disenfranchisement and denial of equal opportunity and discrimination and oppression that comes with it, the fact that different legal, social, and citizenship standing for some human beings, as opposed to others, that was based solely on the color of one group's skin, has been enshrined in law in this country since 1641. My dear white progressive friends, just because you don't see color, just because you don't want to identify people by labels, it does not mean that this government does not. It always has, from the very earliest legal decisions in this regard, and it does to this day. Racialized chattel slavery in America lasted for more than 2 centuries. The United States received less than 400,000 of the 12 million Africans shipped to the New World in the transatlantic slave trade. But by the end of that 2.5 centuries of enslavement, the population of African descendants had grown to around 4 million people. And that's a rough estimate. It's not even accurate. But even with so-called emancipation, race-based laws that were designed to keep black citizens, black people, because we weren't citizens, from being full citizens in this country continued to be passed. In the United States, the Black Code laws were passed by Southern states in 1865 and 66 after the Civil War. These laws had the specific intent of restricting African Americans' freedom and of compelling us to work in a labor economy based on low wages or debt. It was debt peonage and wage slavery. Why? Because slavery built the economy and the political power of not just the South, but of the United States. The cotton that American citizens and people in other countries in the world wore on their backs came from cotton picked by slaves. The sugar people around the world seasoned their food with, harvested by slaves. The tea people drank, harvested by slaves. In the United States in particular, cotton was king, but so was tobacco. So the tobacco people smoked, chewed, ground into snuff, picked and harvested by slaves. At one point, the cotton export to the rest of the world from the United States was nearly 70% of the total exports of this entire country. There was no way the United States was going to let go of all that free forced labor that had built the economy and the political power of this country for 2.5 centuries. So the convict lease system, based on black codes, vagrancy laws, pig laws in the South, were born. Formal segregation also existed in the North. Some neighborhoods were restricted to blacks, and job opportunities were denied to them by unions. We have many white progressives who speak so highly of union support of Martin Luther King Jr., but they do not know the history of unions in the United States and the fact that unions at one time excluded blacks from membership and actively kept free blacks from getting jobs. Blacks who moved to the North in the Great Migration after World War I might have been able to live without the same degree of physical oppression that they experienced in the South, but the elements of racism and discrimination still existed. From a reading here, it says, despite the actions of abolitionists, life for free blacks was far from idyllic in the North due to racism. Most free blacks lived in racial enclaves in the major cities in the North: New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Cincinnati. Their poor living conditions led to disease and death. In a Philadelphia study in 1846, practically all poor black infants died shortly after birth. Even wealthy blacks were prohibited from living in white neighborhoods due to whites' fear of declining property values. This was in the 1800s. Redlining in the North, Jim Crow in the South, school segregation all throughout the country, separate but equal, black workers locked out of union participation in the North, unpunished mob and police brutality and violence against blacks throughout the country, especially after World War II in the Red Summer of 1920. Unpunished lynchings, race-based voting restrictions, and even racial discrimination in New Deal programs have all served to create the level of income inequality for black people today that is much deeper than income inequality as it is experienced by everyone else. In a recent CNN poll that was published, a study rather, that was published in August of last year, I apologize, I didn't have time to upload it, but the average income of white Americans at the time of that study's publishing was around $70,000. The average income of black Americans, around $43,000. White home ownership, more than 50%. Black home ownership, around 13%. From the CNN article, the quote that encapsulates this issue of even well-meaning white people ignoring racism, actually exacerbating racism. This quote, I think, encapsulates this problem. It says, perhaps the most telling statistic was that 43% of blacks said they felt that the country would not make the necessary changes needed to give blacks racial equity in all areas of American life. That's compared to 11% of whites who felt that way. Regardless of whether well-meaning white moderates or progressives or liberals see color or not, regardless of whether they want to continue to identify people by labels or not, the law, this society, the policies and the practices that have developed over time, that have come out of the racism that this society was built on, most assuredly do see our color. And the inequality that we face in this country, the discrimination, the disenfranchisement, the oppression, the abuse, all stems from the fact that those with power treat us that way because they see our color and they value our lives less because of that. So ignoring the one factor that determines whether we truly have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in this country serves no purpose other than to ignore the actual problem of racism. This is why so many Black people don't feel the country will make the necessary changes needed to improve this, because the country wants to continue to pretend like this racism isn't a problem. And not just the country, again. Because we're not talking about the Klan in this discussion. We're not talking about the Concerned Citizens Council members in this discussion. We're not talking about the alt-right. We're not talking about white nationalists. We're talking about the white moderates who want to tell us how angry we should or should not be when we talk about this continued racial discrimination that continues to deny us full liberation, justice, and equality in this country. We're talking about the well-meaning white moderate, progressive, liberal, who wants to tell us that we shouldn't talk about race anymore. Because race isn't a problem, class is a problem. I think I'll talk about that one next week. We're talking about the well-meaning white moderate, progressive, liberal, who tells us that we need to stop being divisive and we need to just unify. We need unity. We need to stop identifying each other by labels. I don't see color, and everything would be better if you didn't see color too. Here's the problem. We didn't create the laws that identify us and discriminate against us and deny us equal access to liberty, opportunity, and justice based on color. So we're not the ones you need to be convincing that we need to not see color. There are certain events in history that are so horrific and that are so perfectly encapsulating of the danger of ignoring the landmine of racial animosity and hatred in this country, that it would be a disservice to continue to ignore them because they're uncomfortable for us to watch. The massacre that occurred in Tulsa, Oklahoma, destroying the successful, self-sufficient, and independent Black town of free Blacks in Greenwood, Oklahoma, occurred not because people didn't see the color of its citizens. It occurred because people did. And they simply did not believe that people of that color should have that much stuff. So I leave you tonight with some archival footage, recently found actually, of Greenwood, Oklahoma, or as we affectionately call it, Black Wall Street. Thank you for joining me tonight. Please share this video. Please join me next week at 9 p.m. where we'll continue this discussion on race. This is Jacqueline Lukman. This has been Brick by Brick.
Some African-American communities are prospering, like the residents of Greenwood, a suburb of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Here, former slaves were given land after the Civil War, and this rare footage shows the thriving town they built. A remarkable Baptist pastor named Solomon Sir Jones is the pioneering filmmaker. His footage was lost for more than 50 years. Jones captures the bustling life of Greenwood, which could be any American small town. But Tulsa's whites don't like what they see. In May 1921, after a black man is accused of assaulting a white woman, a white mob rampages through the city. For a night and a day, they loot and burn Greenwood. A Fox News crew captures the only surviving footage. It is the bloodiest racial massacre in American history, leaving nearly 300 dead.
Building it brick by brick.